Thank you again, Sylvia. If everybody can give her some affirmations in the chat box. A wonderful presentation. Thank you for the offering of the resources as well. Just want to remind folks there's a wealth of resources in those Google folders. Please look through them. Please use them. Bring them into your practice, your classroom, and work with your students. And we're going to be transitioning now to our last speaker, last speaker for our lineup today. It's been an exciting day, and we got Alejandro, who's locked and loaded, ready to go. So me and Alejandro don't know each other, but we know a lot of the same people, and I have a strong feeling that we're going to be strong community friends. Brothers in the near future. And so I want to introduce him, Dr. Alejandro Villalpando. I'm sorry, brother, I don't know how to pronounce your name perfectly. Villalpando.
Yeah, that's good.
Villalpando holds a joint appointment as an assistant professor in the Department of Pan-African Studies and the Latin American Studies program at Cal State LA. He was born and raised in South Central Los Angeles, a teacher, scholar, where he continues to live, organize, and learn. He received his Ph.D. in critical ethnic studies at the University of California, Riverside, his master's degree in Latin American Studies at Cal State LA, and his work lies at the intersection of Black, Central American, and ethnic studies. And he has co-authored chapter entitled The Racialization of Central Americans in the U.S. and the edited volume Precarity and Belonging, published by Rutgers University Press. In addition, Alejandro was a co-founder, co-organizer, and co-facilitator for a year-long political education project entitled The Abolition Open School. The project was a multi-campus, multi-system collaboration between faculty across the UC and Cal State system. He's also incredibly shaped and inspired by the history of his ancestors, his neighbors, and the intellectual visionaries that have guided his development as a scholar, pedagogue, and activist. He is committed to be part of the crafting of a world rooted in justice, equity, and dignity for all people, and is inspired by his young child and partner who remain the bedrocks of his existence. Beautifully put.
Thank you so much, Ron, and thank you so much to the colleagues who presented previously and to the organizers for putting this together. I know these type of endeavors are, take a lot of work, and I'm grateful to be in this space and sharing with you all. I'm grateful that we're keeping each other as safe as possible through the virtual option. I'm grateful that this will be living on beyond this moment, much like all of our energies and the energies of those that came before us. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to a presentation, a PowerPoint here. Kind of reiterate some of the things that were already said in that intro. Let me see. I've used the computer before. And just folks, I'm recovering, almost done recovering from COVID for the first time. So here we are dealing with this pandemic that is still ongoing. So the title of my presentation is, is Connecting to and Creating Life Amidst Chaos, Reflection from a Teacher Scholar. So I start with these images here because as my intro said, South Central is a very important part of my existence and my development, particularly the time period that I grew up in. I grew up amidst the war on drugs that was concurrent with the imperialist interventions in Central America, the destruction of Mexico's economy and the entire country because of neoliberalism and the exploitation of that country that consequently impacted the way that South Central ended up looking in my upbringing. South Central was predominantly a Black community when I was growing up as a child. These places in particular are really important. Florence and Normandy was the site of one of the major sparks of the 1992 Los Angeles uprising, the riots that really were a culmination of Black and brown exploitation, Black and brown oppression, and really the systemic neglect and abandonment that faced our communities. The other mural that maybe some of you all recognize says South Central Dreams. It is a mural by indigenous folks from Mexico who came through and started doing the Oaxaca, California murals and eventually got kicked out of the state, because they were rebellious and not refusing the logics and the rubrics of what the state asked ask people to do when they're coming out and doing work here. And then you got the traditional block lettering from our neighborhoods and the palm trees, right? We're from the communities of palm trees and G's. So, that's a little bit about me, right? But all these things shape my pedagogical approaches, the way that I envision the world, and also the way that I've engaged in intellectual development. Black studies and the history of Black folks has tremendously impacted me as a person. My own indigenous background, my mother is Maya Quiche from Guatemala, originally from Shela, but displaced in the early 1900s to Mazatenango. And my father is a working class Mexican person who was working on plantations at the age of 7 in a small town called Ixtlahuacán de los Ríos in Jalisco. All of those, right, and then so on and so forth. And all those things shape my visions and my approaches in the classroom and the way that I entered academia and continue to be here. I begin with this, because I did want to offer a kind of a takeaway form, right? So an artifact, right? Because we were asked, and I really appreciated the question to really materialize or ground us in actual practices that we engage in the classroom. I began this intake form during the pandemic. And if you all notice here in the intake form, right, the first 4 are just basic questions, but 5, 6, 7, and 8 were really important. And I think they speak to the context of where I teach. So I teach at Cal State LA, which is predominantly students of color, predominantly first generation students, predominantly working class or working poor students. We have a significant number of criminalized students. We have a significant number of undocumented students, right? So when we think about vulnerable populations, those are very systematically vulnerabilized populations on our campuses. As such, right, like I created this intake form, and question 5 was really important because we do have a lot of caretakers. And I think a lot of times we forget, or our students forget, and when we're growing up in our communities, we forget that we are caretakers, whether we're parents or not, right? We engage in a bunch of different care work, and our students take that for granted sometimes. And we as educators definitely take that for granted and don't understand the kind of necessities in thinking about that when we're engaging with our students, right? So the 5th question is, are you a designated caretaker? This includes if you're a parent, an older sibling who takes care of younger children, a medical advocate for an elder or disabled person, and anything in between or beyond these categories. I didn't come up with those myself necessarily. I came up with those because my students started sharing things with me, saying that, oh, I go pick up my dad after work because, I have the car. My dad doesn't drive, or he can't drive. I'm the one that drops off my mom to the doctors. I'm the one that does this and this and that. And so over time, I thought, man, these are really big responsibilities that impact the student's ability, a student's time, right, as a resource, as a precious resource to be able to succeed in the classroom. And it also expands the notion of caretaker beyond kind of a traditional gendered notion of care work, right? Like that becomes very patriarchal, right? Like a mother is a caretaker and that's it. And I think that a lot of our students are not necessarily just mothers, they're caretakers in a multitude of ways. The other part, right? Do you work? If so, how many hours? Reading these intake forms, once I did them, seeing the amount of labor that our students do literally as workers, you have students working anywhere from 20 to 50 hours on top of 5 classes and on top of having 3 kids. It really is astounding. And that's not like that's a kind of an average profile of a Cal State LA student. It's not like out of the ordinary, right? And then the number 8 question was really important, right? Do you have reliable access to a computer, laptop, tablet, or any other device, and Wi-Fi? Those are very important because at the beginning of the pandemic, right, there was those stories of that you had 1 tablet per household with multiple kids being on the tablet because they needed to go to the K through 12 school. And so our students didn't have access to that. And so Cal State LA, got funding, and then there was hotspots and there was tablets and there was some laptops that could go out on loan. And so that type of information, while those resources are available, and I'm sure a lot of you all are familiar with this at your institutions, those resources may be available sometimes, but students, the information around that is not. So then those answers to those questions gave me a really great like idea and profile of these students that I would get in my classroom at the beginning of the pandemic. And then I was able to guide them and respond to the questions, right? This became a no credit assignment, but if they did it, it became, going back to the question of grading, it became something that I just gave points for, right? I didn't count it as points, but if they did it and if they needed extra points at the end, then, we're bumping it up some more, right? But all of these different things, right, allowed me to kind of attend and engage and develop, demonstrate investment in our students' whole existence as whole beings, as part of much more than an individual with a CIN number in my classroom, as individuals that are part of collectives at home and their communities at work, right? And on another more logistical, like fundamental level, it allowed me to pair students together, similar majors. I initially started pairing students that were really busy with students that weren't that busy to do weekly assignments through this. That's really the main assignment that I have in my class, is to do weekly reading notes and reflections, right? With no quizzes and no midterms anymore. I took away all that stuff. And the result has been really great. But one of the things that I found after the first semester was that I had a mother who was really busy, work with a student who was not a parent and did not have as many responsibilities. So the deadline is, X time or whatever. The mother was like, I have my stuff done on Saturday at 5 p.m. I cannot wait for another person's time. And they're like, I'm not trying to throw my classmate under the bus because they are doing the work. It's just our schedules don't align. So the following semester, then I became responsive to that and started pairing people with similar demographic backgrounds, similar kind of responsibilities, because if you're more busy, it's better to work with other people that are really busy because you stay on top of your stuff, right? You have this really like strict routine, right? And if you're kind of more flexible, then you could work with someone that can turn something in at 11:55 when it's due at 11:59 p.m., And so these students end up pushing and shaping and kind of advancing one's own pedagogical approach at the university level, for me at least, right? When one can be responsive, when one can provide the space for students to provide information about themselves and then be open to listening, one can then kind of tailor one's approach in the classroom to the way that they are. And again, I begin with this after my own introduction as a person, because I think this reflects the type of investment, right? It's emblematic of the investment that I have in my students. I share these things. When I asked this question about number 5, I asked them, what do y'all think about that question number 5? Oh, that was interesting that you asked us that. Why did you, and I said, why y'all think I asked that? And then I tell them, I have 2 chronically ill parents. I've been caretaking for my dad for 5 years. My dad was in an ICU for 11 days and, he was more on the other side than on this side, but thankfully he survived and he's in recovery and doing well now. My mother just recently had a heart attack in Guatemala. And so she's also recovering and, dealing with a shift in her ability. And so I tell them these things and I become more human to them. And I think when I become more human to them in the classroom, they believe that I believe that they're human beings too. And it's weird. I know everyone's gonna, I'm sure this is a shock to everyone here. No, I'm just playing. I'm sure everybody can relate to this. But when you treat people like human beings, when you show up for them like a human being, they're willing to do so much more for you, right? They're willing to do so much more for themselves. If you come into the classroom demonstrating that you're willing to run through a wall for students, they're willing to run through a wall. They're willing to run through a wall for you. And I have found that over my time as a cis hetero male, right, who used to be a pelon, looking like a cholo when I walked into the classroom. I used to come in real stern, going back to what Cynthia said earlier. I used to come in real stern. I used to come in real, the first 2 sessions, I'd be like, don't mess around with me. These are my deadlines and this is that, because I had this insecurity, right? I felt like students were going to take me serious. And then I would be my regular, jovial, humane self in the second week. But I found that over time, that was just a waste of my time. Time is limited and time is precious. I should just come in who I am. My value should be here on the first day. My presentation should be here on the first day. My invitation to how I envision the classroom as a space should be present on the first day. I shouldn't be hiding behind a facade of archaic authoritarianism in the classroom, you know? I shouldn't be up here like trying to be like this authoritarian, you know? Like, I'm just a person, you know? Like, I'm a hood kid that happened to like make it to where I am today, right? With the help of so many other people. And my commitments to this go beyond, right, like the accolades and my credentials and all those things, right? My commitment is, and I tell my students now that I'm a parent, is to hopefully invite you all to be part of the creation of another world so that my kid and the next generation of kids have it a little bit easier, right? And so that seems to be really effective for me as an educator in the classroom. So anyway, I shared this intake form. If any of y'all are interested, it's a good way to pair students up. It's a good way to demonstrate your investment in them. And then I wanted to kind of switch gears a little bit here. This is the compa Dr. Steven Osuna. He's at Long Beach State right now in the Department of Sociology. I'll go ahead and read this quote aloud here. Because I think it's been said in multiple ways today here, but I'll just go ahead and echo this. Schools, colleges, and universities reproduce the social relations of oppression and exploitation. The struggles in these terrains to shape interpretations, solutions, and responses to public concerns is therefore of the utmost importance. Interventions from radical scholarship that identify the root causes and structural conditions of exploitation and oppression and that prioritize the interests of aggrieved communities are vital and will occur only if scholars and intellectuals are in conversation with these communities. So I begin with South Central always, and I come back to South Central here. I still live in my community. I'm fortunate enough to have invested in this community. I live in the same neighborhood that I spent a lot of my formative years in, where most of my family lives in the community. This actually is supposed to have an image of the book this comes from. This is from a book called The Futures of Black Radicalism. It's an edited volume. So I'm sorry it didn't appear here. So again, to break down this quote, right? Like, we're here not under the misgivings that our institutions are any sites of liberatory practice, right? I think a lot of us know that schools are meant to discipline and limit the visions and the possibilities of what our students and our communities actually like desire for themselves, right? Our institutions tend to want to produce successful individuals, right? Not ingratiated and integrated community members. Right. And we have to constantly be aware of that and hopefully attempt to disrupt that. Right. Hopefully attempt to disrupt that. And so one of the ways that I disrupt that is by blending and bridging the work that I do in the community as an organizer, as an abolitionist, and as an anti-policing activist, right, in my community. So sorry, y'all hear my dog here in the background. So the summer of 2020, I think, really impacted a lot of people. I think it opened a lot of folks' eyes and it invited people to the party, right? Like to the anti-policing party, to the party of dreaming of more radical possibilities, more ethical futures, more dignified presence, and all of that good stuff, right? We unfortunately had this moment of awakening amidst the beginning of the pandemic, pre-vaccines, and the slayings of four notable folks in the national imagination: Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd. And I put Tony McDade there because I think it's very important. Tony McDade was a Black trans man who was killed, whose story did not garner the same kind of national attention. And I think that I think there's reasons for that go that speak towards the heteropatriarchal notion of how we envision the world, right? Like, we still envision the world in a very binary way. We still put value on victims, and that's unfortunate. So amidst this uprising of 2020, plenty of people came out into the streets to protest. A lot of people went out to Hollywood because YG was out there, right? A lot of people went out to these large-scale Black Lives Matter events and throughout the country. And people became active in the movement for police accountability and to some extent for police abolition. Los Angeles also witnessed and experienced a surge in high-profile killings by the police, unfortunately. We saw the killing of Andres Guardado in June of 2020 in Gardena, California. We saw the killing of Dejan Kazee in Westmont, California on August 31st. And we saw the killing of Fred Williams in Willowbrook/Compton in October, I forget the date, October 11th or something of 2020. This all happened probably within I want to say like 8 square miles of the city, south of the 10 freeway. I was active in all of these movements. They were killed out of the Compton Sheriff Station. Deputies from the Compton Sheriff Station killed Andres Guardado. Deputies out of the South LA Sheriff Station killed Dejan Kazee. And deputies out of the Century Station killed Fred Williams. Tens of thousands of people marched out into the streets throughout the city, right? And people were active. There was people from spaces and locations that had never been out in the streets who came out and became active. And it was a moment to kind of seize for a lot of us. And as an academic, as a community member, and as just a human being, you know, I was deeply touched. Dejan Kazee was killed 4 blocks away from where I grew up. He was killed 2 blocks away from the elementary school that all my nephews went to. In fact, one of my nephews went to one of the protests that we organized out in the community. And when he was walking by, 3 of the young women who knew Dejan, who were out from the community, were like, "What are you doing out here?" It turns out they went to elementary school together. It was a really impactful moment for my family, for our community, to see people finally come out and join the struggle against the oppression that we had grown so accustomed to. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the killing of Andres Guardado. So Andres Guardado, this picture that you see on the right of this altar was actually at his family's vigil in their home in Koreatown. This was after the first year anniversary. We were fortunate enough to be invited to spend time with the family. I've been fortunate enough to build a relationship with both of his parents, Cristobal and Elisa. Don Cristobal is a working class person. He's part of a union. He's part of a Unite Local Here 11. He works in a hotel in downtown as a cook. Andres Guardado's story, for those of you that don't know, he had 2 jobs. He had just graduated high school. He was a student that was going to Los Angeles Trade Tech. He was very committed to his family. The reason he had picked up a second job, the second job that he was at when the police killed him, was to help Cristobal and the family, because Cristobal had been laid off because of the pandemic. His family comes from El Salvador. They fled a country that was also under U.S. occupation and not U.S. occupation, but U.S. funded militarized war that made it impossible for so many people in El Salvador to stay in their countries. So his family fled their country decades ago, only to lose an 18-year-old son on the streets by a state here in Los Angeles. When that news broke, as a scholar of Central American Studies, my heart broke. And I knew I had to go out and join the struggle there. Here you have a picture of his family and unionized workers from local union, the local roofers union 36, joining in solidarity to support the Guardado family in 2021. We just had a second year anniversary action on June 19th or Juneteenth, 2022. And up there you see an interview, a still from an interview on Spectrum News with Cristobal and Don Cristobal and Elisa there. And Doña Elisa says, "The light of my life is gone. I don't know what to say about my son. My boy was unique." And from everything that the family says and all his loved ones, he was very unique. He was a loving young man. He was a young man that looked like any of the students that we could have in our classrooms. And so to me, right, we were asked to reflect on how do we bring about the notion of racial justice and equity, right? We don't ignore what's going on outside in our own communities, right? And I think that a lot of times we get bogged down with the things that are happening in the classroom on our campuses. But there's things going on outside on the streets. And these things to me were not about research. They weren't about my own knowledge production. They were about how all those things I had done beforehand, how they could serve a purpose for these folks, for this family. And so we went out, and I became Don Cristobal's kind of unprofessional, unofficial translator whenever we did press conferences. I became the kind of Spanish go-to person to interview at these protests when Estrella TV, you know, the ones that our families watch, the ones that our abuelas watch the news on, right, in our households. I was the one that was being interviewed oftentimes by these news outlets. So much so that they end up knowing me. And I'm not like the type of person to want to be on TV or anything like that, or on the news. You know, I feel awkward. I feel awkward in the way that I speak and the way that I sound, like a lot of people, right? And especially with my Spanish. But I exercised that muscle because I thought it was in service of something, right? In service of justice for Andres Guardado, in service for our communities, especially our non-Black Latino communities that still tend to have conservative views when it comes to the police. I gave voice to more radical visions of anti-police work, of abolition, and about police accountability. And I was able to do that because I had studied this. I had done this work for so long. I had grown up in this community with a very antagonistic relationship to the police. And when I went to study, I was able to give words to that antagonism. I was able to give history to that antagonism. I was able to give contours to those antagonisms. And so I was able to translate those into layman's terms and into Spanish. And those became the ways that I became of service for the movement for justice for Andres Guardado. And so I went and I did this, right? I kept doing this. We still do this. We're still with this family. The words and the articulation, right, of these kind of catastrophic moments come from texts that are informed by Central American critical ethnic and Black studies, right? And so I go about and I do this, but the stories don't stay outside. The stories come back inside the classroom. So when I'm teaching a class on Black and Latinx relations, and I'm teaching a book called Black and Brown Solidarity on the Racial Politics in the New Gulf in the South, which is based in Baytown, Texas, which is a suburb outside of Houston. And we have a chapter of Black and brown mothers coming together to lead a movement against police brutality and police terrorism. That stuff becomes concretized. It becomes real when I start to talk about the Black and brown mothers, aunts, sisters, loved ones of people like Dejan Kazee, Fred Williams, and Andres Guardado. That becomes real transformative in the classroom. So much so that students then start telling me, you know, undergrad students start sharing with me, you know what? I live in the same complex with that family when they died. It's been real sad over there. So much so when the students tell me, you know, I lost someone to police violence like that too. And you open up that space and you tell them, well, I'm here fighting that stuff because we don't just accept it as a given. And so they tell me things like, oh, it's so interesting, Professor, you know, like, it's good to know that the stuff that you talk about, you also go be about, right? And so that, to me, is the most transformative thing that has happened to me in the last couple of years as an educator, right? Like to start to bridge more vividly, more critically, the work that's done on the ground outside in my communities with the work that we do in the classroom, right? It makes it very real. So in the case of Andres Guardado, right? And I'm going to go to this next context, right? How do we develop like a politics or a language of solidarity in our classrooms, right? For racial justice? Because I didn't want to say, well, you see, they kill Latinos too, the police, right? Because I think that actually limits our solidarity work, right? And so to me, things like Constituting Central American Americans by Maritza Cárdenas, right, talks about the histories of Central Americans, the complications and the complexities of the racial politics within our own communities, right, that exist because Central Americans are Black, Central Americans are Indigenous, Central Americans are Mestizo, Central Americans are Ladino, and all these different identities that exist. And with those things come real power. Right? They come real power both in the isthmus as people cross Mexico and as people get to the United States. And then you have someone like João Costa Vargas, an Afro-Brazilian scholar who wrote this book called Never Meant to Survive that starts to map the violences and the exclusions that Black folks in Watts, in Compton, and South Central have faced, the genocidal conditions that they were left to confront in these communities because they were systematically abandoned. right? So for those of you that are familiar with the news right now, last week there was a story, or maybe 4 days ago in ABC News, for example, right, that Jordan Jordan High School in Watts, right, is still being toxified, and is a very toxic environment for students because of the historic pollution that has existed there, right? There's levels of lead, for example, in that community, near that high school, that are 75 times the permissible point according to the EPA, right? Those are genocidal conditions, right? And so while the demographics of places like Watts, Compton, and South Central have shifted tremendously as Black folks have been forced to flee, have been displaced from South Central, from these historic Black communities, right? And brown folks have moved in, and other Black diasporic people have moved in, the legacies of anti-Black racism continue to shape our realities. The legacies of anti-Black policing continue to shape the things that people in Compton, South Central, and Watts face, that Latinx people in Compton, Watts, and South Central face, right? And so I have these really robust, complex conversations, right? And so I hope that folks are following me here. My brain is still a little foggy, you know, with the whole thingy here that I'm dealing with, right? But this is the work that we do across the semester, right? Talk about these really complicated, integrated, interrelated histories that are layered on top of one another, and the ways that we experience them. When we start to talk about those things and we concretize them through examples, right? Students are more willing to share, and then they take up space in the classroom and they start teaching other students through their experiences as well. So I share a lot of experiences. I practice a lot of strategic vulnerability and the strategic storytelling in the classroom. I think as a male, it's really important to do that as well, to be nurturing and to be caring in a very matter-of-fact way, where it's not like a look at me, I'm nice, you know, where it's actually like an integrated practice, right, in the way that we approach things, and to be sharp in the way that we analyze the conditions that we face, right, and make sure to contextualize them within the system of oppression that exists, that impacts so many of our communities, all of our communities in the global South and here, which is capitalism, right? Capitalism continues to structure our lives and shape our death as well. So anyway, this is the way that I contextualize the killing of Andres Guardado, but also the uprising that ends up being Black and brown for Andres Guardado, right? So solidarity is a verb to me, right? It's not a given. We have to practice that. We have to move forward, and we have to learn, and we have to study, and we have to be in community with folks, right? So I already talked about Compton, South Central, LA, and Watts, and the connotations, right? These places still connote Black space for a lot of people, even though the demographics has changed, right, dramatically. Because they connote Black space, that means they connote a specific relationship to Black history in Los Angeles, which is really important. And because they connote a particular Black history, they also connote institutionalized anti-Black racism, that systemic neglect and abandonment that I talked about, and these cartographies of criminalization, right? Which means basically we live in communities where like everyone's a suspect, right? Like you walk around in our communities and everyone's treated as a suspect. Right. I remember growing up, walking my girlfriend 5 blocks to her house and being harassed by police officers saying, "Pull up your pants," as he rolls up and flashes his light on me, and then starts tapping their gun, right, like on the dashboard. Right. I remember the kind of one time when I was pulled over for riding my bicycle up the block, and I asked, "Why am I being pulled over?" And they said, "Oh, well, you're going against traffic." And then pulling out my wallet and seeing my undergrad ID and throwing it on the ground and laughing at me because I was a history major, and asking me why I returned to the shithole. Why didn't I just stay in La Jolla? You know, those routinized experiences that could lead to death in my community, in the community that Dejan Kazee was killed, right? Because he got killed and pulled over because he was riding his bicycle in the same community, right? Those realities create a geography, an existence, a presence, an energy that Black and brown, working class, working poor people that live in places like South Central, Compton, and Watts feel. It's that feeling you get when a cop U-turns behind you. That's the reality that we all face. And so in the classroom, we talk about those experiences because those experiences engage students. And then we contextualize them with history and the books and the text that we talk about. that they're not just in our heads and they're not just individual experiences that we're making up, that we're being paranoid, right? Students are like, oh, this is why I felt this thing, right? And so what does anti-Black racism and policing have to do with Central Americans and other Latinx working class communities? Well, Andres Guardado was killed by sheriffs out of the Compton Sheriff Station in the city of Gardena. Andres Guardado was killed because we live in a community that has long been occupied by violent, fascistic police officers who don't engage in police brutality per se. They engage in policing. And what I mean by that is that they engage in the art of capture, they engage in the art of violence against Black, brown, and racialized poor people, because that is the nature and the heart and the history of that institution, especially in communities that have been labeled and connote particular violent individuals or people, right? Like Compton, South Central, and Watts. I'm not saying that that's who we are, right? I know no one in here would say that that's who we are, but that is still the way that people view us on the outside, right? So I know that sometimes is really challenging to hear for some people, but I think about right now Venus Williams retiring from tennis and how they're in the conversations about her retirement, Compton will be thought about as a place that she had to escape as opposed to a place that helped build who she was, right? And those things continue to reproduce these conditions and visions of our places as somehow like these savage backlands, like backwater places, right? That then justify police violence in our communities. All right. And so going back to this thing, right, the Black and brown solidarity. So in 2021, the year on the year anniversary of Andres Guardado's killing, we organized a vigil. We co-organized a vigil with his family for him at the place that he got his life taken away from him. That altar right there, those beautiful altars are made by a queer couple of folks that on Instagram are called the Classroom of Compassion. You've probably seen these in Uvalde. You saw them in Buffalo. You definitely see them all over Southern California whenever there's a vigil, either for a celebrity that has passed or unfortunately too often for someone that's been killed by the police. There you see a piece of art with Oscar Romero on the right-hand side, or your right-hand side, and Andres Guardado being met by San Romero. That was done by the homie Dicho Don Bicho, who some of you all may know, Victor Itiriano, who's a Salvadoran artist. That right there on the right is his mother, is Doña Elisa. Andres Guardado's mother. Right here on the left, you see a young Black woman by the name of Miss Aquaria. Miss Aquaria is actually the aunt, the paternal aunt of Dejan Kazee, who got killed just a few weeks after Andres Guardado. To me, these images are so powerful, and the experiences have been so powerful to demonstrate what real Black and brown unity looks like in my communities. Right? In these moments of struggle and tragedy, right? Like there's so much love that emerges amongst our people. And those are the things that I've experienced in South Central LA, which is why I feel like a debt and a big gratitude towards Black folks, Black struggle, in making me the scholar that I am and the person that I am, right? And so these forms of solidarity continue to persist and arise in the present. And I think for me in the classroom, it becomes even more important, more vital, more crucial for students to see the actual materialization of solidarity like this versus just in a book, right? It's not that the book is not important. It's not that the piece of art is not important, but it's the stuff, solidarity as a verb, as an action that we create and cultivate, or we assist and create and cultivate these spaces where people can come together and hold each other while they're grieving these tragic conditions, but also find inspiration and empowerment as we fight for justice for our people, right? As my partner says, right, like, and other folks have said, we fight for the living, we fight for the living. Right. And we commemorate the dead, right? Like we commemorate the dead and we fight for the living. And we do that in every which way. And I see solidarity as a way to fight for the living and fighting for the dead. So how does this then blend into come back to the classroom? More specifically, we have a student here in the audience, and thank you so much for joining us, Susanna. Susanna's actually joining us from Portugal right now. So I'm very happy about that. Susanna Franick just recently completed their MA at Cal State LA in the Interdisciplinary Studies program. I was fortunate enough to be the chair of her project. Her project ended up being an emancipatory arts-based pedagogy, where she created a series of 3 zines. On top of the 3 zines, she created an Instagram page that acts as a multimedia kind of archival project of the work that she did through these zines to become more accessible for other people who want to see this work. Oftentimes we get students in our campus who ask, I don't want my work just to be stuck here in like academia where no one's going to read it or only certain people are going to read it. I want it to be like to touch the community, right? I want my work to go beyond the classroom or beyond the rectors of our library, you know? And so that's Susanna engaged in this project. And so the titles of the zines are as follows: Transnational Histories of Violence Across the Americas, Mapping the Migration Trajectory from Central America through Mexico to South Central Los Angeles. Part 2, Histories of Police Violence in South Central Los Angeles, Mapping White Supremacy, Sheriff Deputy Gangs, Abuse of Power, the Murder of Andres Guardado, and a Flurry of Anti-Police Activism. And Part 3, Resistance Movements, Anti-Racist, Anti-Violent Policing Strategies, Radical Reframing of Anti-Racist Policing, Pathways of Progressive Activism, Acts of Resistance that Foster Solidarity, and Artivism, Cultural and Artistic Production Challenging Systems of Oppression. If y'all are interested, you all can visit this Instagram page, and I'm going to try to switch over here real quick. I'm going to stop share. I'm going to do this. Or not. Here we go. I get confused and nervous. All right. I'm going to show you all a little bit. My dog got excited. So what you have here is an example of some of these pages. And it's beautiful collages of work that demonstrate, for example, this gentleman here, Sheriff Villanueva, who is running for re-election, by the way. If you're interested and you're with that voting thing, you should be aware that this guy's running for re-election. He seems to be the biggest gang leader of Los Angeles. And you have this entire write-up here on the caption. This is a tremendous project. I'm very proud to have been part of this. And it talks about mapping police violence in the community and maps where Andres Guardado was killed, right? It's a multidisciplinary project. It's a multimedia project. I don't want to spend too much time here on it, but it gives you further readings to engage upon that were used here. It's a tool. Right? It's a tool for us to learn, for college students to learn, for community members to learn, for any number of folks to continue to learn and advance your project to understand the conditions that our people face and give words to these conditions. And so, I'm sorry. I wanted to share that those zines then, Susanna was able to get a generous grant from, not so generous, it could always be more generous, but from campus, a grant to print these zines in black and white and in full color. So they're bounded and they're tied up in a nice little bow. And so we've been able to distribute them throughout Patria Coffee in Compton, down the street from where Andres Guardado was unfortunately killed, and also distributed them to the family and activists and organizers who've come out to different events. So given the constraints of the pandemic, this has been a really exciting vision and product, and an example of, I wanted to use this example also because it's a grad student example, because I knew that our other colleagues were going to talk about more undergrad and community college students. So I wanted to give an example of what kind of work can be produced when we think outside the traditional realms of knowledge production at the graduate level. And so how do we think about work that can go beyond the classroom and beyond the semester, beyond the finishing of a degree, right? Something that can live on, and something that, in my opinion and in my estimation, right, can make families feel like their kids' stories and their kids' life and their struggles are not going to be forgotten by people outside of their own family, right? That their kids' stories, their realities, their deaths, the way that they lived, the way that they loved, the way that they demonstrated their commitment to their own family. Andres was a very family-oriented young man, that's not lost on people. And that the rage that continues to be necessary to contend with these systems of oppression and violence and genocidal logics meets an end eventually, right? And so while a lot of the stuff is dreary, right, when we talk about death, in building community, right, like in teaching community and teaching the importance of community, I think it's important to remember the words of Bell Hooks. It was clear to audiences that I practiced what I preached. That union of theory and praxis was a dynamic example for teachers seeking practical wisdom. I do not mean to be immodest in openly evaluating the quality of my teaching and writing about teaching. My intent is to bear witness so as to challenge the prevailing notion that it is simply too difficult to make connections. This is not so. Those of us who want to make connections, who want to cross boundaries, do. I want all passionate teachers to revel in a job well done to inspire students training to be teachers, right? So that's from Teaching for Community and a Pedagogy of Hope. And I leave you all with this. This is a picture of Andres Guardado's niece from the last action. She drew a picture and she held it up the whole action. She remembers her tío. And it felt good to us to let her know that we remember her tío too. That we honor this young man. And at this place, we passed out the zines, right? So thank y'all so much. Sorry for my long-windedness here. I hope that my meandering thoughts made sense to folks. Any questions or comments, I'd appreciate it. Thank y'all so much. Rest in peace and rest in power, Andres Guardado. Oh, one more thing. Sorry. Come through. We have an action. We have organized an action. It's going to be the 2nd year anniversary action for. Speaking of all of this, Dejan Kaziz's father just got let out of the cage, showing the depths of anti-Black violence that this family has gone through. This will be a first action that he's able to attend and be part of for his son since they killed him. It's 1 p.m. August 28th, which is a Sunday. We would love if anyone could come out and join us. We'll march to the South LA station to let those killers know that we have not forgotten what they've done and that we continue to demand justice for Dejan Kazi. And so we would love, any and all folks to come join us. So thank you so much. All right.
Thank you, Alejandro. Just a powerful presentation. Reminding us that the stories of what happens in our communities don't stay outside of the classroom, but they're intertwined like intimately. And it's really our work to bring them into our classrooms and to make the learning like not just real, but also urgent, to make the learning relevant, to help our students understand that it matters and that their learning is serving towards liberation, fighting against these structures and systems of white supremacy and oppression, but also to think about liberation in our own homes as well. And so I appreciate you modeling that vulnerability of being caring and loving to our students and to our community as cishet men. I think it's really important, and it's powerful because that's a part of our own liberation and our own liberatory process as well. So thank you so much. And there's a lot of love and affirmations in the chat box. So please, anybody, feel free to bring your affirmations to light, to share them with Alejandro, to share them with our group, to also open your questions as well.
Hi, I just wanted to add something that I kept thinking about while Alejandro was speaking. we have a lot of the same sort of content and practices, but your experiences you were sharing, and the like being from Dijon's neighborhood, and your personal experiences with the police are particular to you, right? And what it made me think about was how what I do in the classroom is also important, and it's very different because I'm very light skinned and I understand my light skin privilege. But part of that understanding has been in the experiences I've had with police where they don't give me a ticket, where they let me go. And so I often bring that into the classroom, which is super important to talk about. Like if our experiences are opposite of what we're seeing, and contextualizing for students why that is occurring, right? So I often do that as well. So I just want to remind folks that if we don't have those experiences that are, the negative encounters with police, unpacking and dissecting what those encounters are that we are having. And so I often share with students all the different experiences I've had with police, where I lived in Maryland in the suburbs for a while, and I got pulled over regularly due to the car I was driving, but never got a ticket. And so really unpacking all of those things for students, and how scary it was at times. There were multiple troopers at one time, right? And then even their surprise when they found me behind the wheel. Right. And so unpacking all of these things, right, for students is a really good way to sort of address levels of privilege and help them reflect on their own levels of privilege. So I just really was left thinking about that as I can relate so much with the work that you're doing, Alejandro. And then yet my personal experience is also quite different, even though I grew up in Inglewood, neighboring South Central, and went to high school in South Central at Ph.D. Learning Center. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Cynthia. And a lot of our students don't have those particularly negative experiences, right? And so the question is always why, right? And so why do you think, right? And so then that opens up another aspect to extend. So thank you so much for bringing that up. That's a crucial conversation. It's also a very controversial topic to be an anti-policing person and abolitionist, right? People look at you like you're still out of your mind. How could you do that? And so I share my experiences, especially because I want people to know I'm not speaking this in the abstract, right? I've lived these communities. I believe in this. I work towards this, right? And so it's not just about going to protest at a police station, right? We work at a community garden here to try to build community, right? We do all the things that entail the broad vision of what it means to build an abolitionist future, right? Which is to build community across generations, across races, across class, right? Here in our own communities. And so that's really important for us. And it helps students kind of demystify what it means to be an abolitionist, or even just care about oppression, right? It's not this huge, sexy, let's get on a mic and down with the police, ACAB, although I love the chants, you know what I'm saying? My favorite one is the long one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, all that. It's not just about that, right? It's about how we move in the world in an anti-carceral, anti-punitive way. And I think that those are things that are really everyone's able to grasp, right? I don't get too much into the privilege politics stuff, right? Because I feel sometimes that becomes in the classroom, it can kind of bog down a little bit, right? Especially given the context, but I think it comes out anyway, right? So I think that we all approach that stuff in unique and distinct ways based, like you said, on our own kind of positionality, right? In our existences. So thank you so much for bringing that up. I see another. Oh, sorry.
I think Maya had a question, Alejandro.
Yeah, and I did see another question in the chat. I was going through it. Sorry, I'm a chismoso, so I'm all up in there. I'm trying to look.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay. Hi, Alejandro. It's Maya.
Is it Chinchilla?
Chinchilla from the Bay.
¿Cómo estamos?
Good. Try and keep it going. I very much appreciated all the panelists today, so thank you so much. I'm sort of in between teaching and also moving away from teaching to a degree, but I've got some last minute classes I'm preparing for on that adjunct life. Mm-hmm. So I teach both City College and at a UC right now, and I was very impressed by the zine making, because I do that in a media, a Latinx media class, where students get to sort of choose. We critique the media the first half of the semester, and then I ask them to produce media, so that they know from the inside out, like how difficult it is to actually produce your vision, even though it's not a production class at all. So I know that it was a master's student, and they probably had other protocols they had to go through, or think through, or writings and research. But I was just wondering if you had any conversations about like parameters, or because I'm thinking about a lot of times the creative projects, because they're in a class that isn't necessarily creative based, but we're talking about these hard, heavy concepts. Do you think through some parameters around that, or some like ideas about like the beginning, middle, and end of making a zine? Or I don't know. I mean, I'm almost like also just want to contact your student and have her come.
No, she's right here. She's right here. I just wrote in the chat, Susanna, if you want to share. I will just say that I had no idea, how to engage in this, right? And I think Susanna and I both kind of were exploring and experimenting together. And I think as a faculty member in LAS, we have this thing where we're like, okay, what do you want to do? All right, let's do it. Why not? Right? It's just why not? Why can't we do this? Right. And so it's very exploratory. And I felt like we were just kind of like, this took 2 years. And it was a culmination of a lot of 2 years worth of work with Susanna, and Susanna's work in other classes that she was able to grab, info from, an art faculty member, I believe, and then women and gender studies, and all these different pieces that ended up coming together. And it's actually really tremendous to see the culmination. It was just, that first one was so hard to get out. And then the second one came quicker. And then the third one was kind of like, boom, all right, we got it. And, I see Cindy right here saying, we're a nurturing space, and I think we allow students to explore. And so there really is no parameters for us, right? But I think that has different based on the location and the department and the culture that exists, right? I think we have a very unique and distinct culture here. Susanna, do you want to share?
Sure. So I just wanted to say that it was a really long process. There's like a 40, 50 page document that goes with it to explain. Unfortunately, the Instagram, the zines open up as pages, but unfortunately there's something wrong on Instagram and it's not leading to that. But anyway, I think the whole idea with the zines also is just to really almost meditate on the topic, because it was so heavy and emotional for me going through that, and going back to Central America and the violence and the U.S. imperialist, militaristic, the militarism that runs throughout from Latin America through Mexico to South Central, and really wanted to end with solutions and looking what some of the other advocacy, resistance movements have gained in terms of just models that the community that Alejandro has so beautifully expressed tonight and is so intimately involved with. Those community members start to have access to this information in a way that's accessible through the zines. And that they can think through these things differently. And maybe there's some aspects of some of the indigenous movements back in Central America that can apply to something that might resonate for them to do and put into action. But the creative process, I think, is so important. And, just the cut and paste, the very tactical aspect of putting these zines together, and how messy they are and how imperfect they are. And that's the beauty that, any student who doesn't, and I don't have a strong art background, I have some photography, etc., but, they get intimidated that, I can't, hey, just go and have fun with it, mess with it, get emotional with that content that you're expressing academically through some tactile cutting and pasting and scribbling and writing. Thanks for letting me talk.
Thank you, Susanna.
Agreed. Yeah, I think it could be so healing to that creative outlet. Thank you for sharing, Susanna. Hey, Alejandro, we have a question in the Q&A we were hoping you can answer from David Chavez. So he says, could you share the significance of this type of pedagogy and activism to build power in this current movement? I'm really feeling your discussion is returning us to why San Francisco State University students fought for ethnic studies in the first place. Only one demand was a class major Department of Ethnic Studies, but the other demands and context gets erased by the institutions. Can you share your thoughts on that? And that may be our last question before we wrap up.
Yeah, thank you so much, David, and thank you so much, Ron, and thank you so much, Ron, also for moderating. Thank you so much for the reflections. I appreciate that. I think that, for me, ethnic studies is has always been a political project, right? And it's been absorbed into the university to be a kind of institutionalized thing where like knowledge production is very important, right? Like, but sometimes, right, like in some ways, right, like in an academic sense, right? And I think it's different for K through 12 folks, right? I think it's different. Like, I think, Ron, you mentioned earlier that your first ethnic studies scholars were not, right? Like your first ethnic studies teachers were not professors. Right?
They were poets, yeah.
Right, like it's people in the community, right? Maya, I would imagine, Maya, I think about you as an ethnic studies scholar because of the work that you've done in Cha-Cha-Cha Pina files and everything else before that, right? And so I think that, there's been a contradiction that arises, as I think that, the institution, has seen the importance and the power and the possibilities, or saw the importance power and possibilities of ethnic studies as a political project, right? As a political demand, not just to be included in the curriculum, but to be included as full human beings, right? As people that have history, for example, right? Like, because there's something like there's something that always like ends up being like the narrative, right? Which is like, oh, I want students to learn that we have history, right? And I think that's important, right? But like that we are people that have history, right? Like that's really important, right? Because so many of us encounter a world where we don't see ourselves in the world, right? But we don't see ourselves as humans sometimes, right? Like in the full expanse of that. And I think in an academic setting, that includes thinking about our histories, our struggles, our successes, and our kind of revolts. Right? It's not just how good we are to be included. It's also how good we've been at demanding beyond, like stuff beyond inclusion, right? Beyond, like, dignified living, like the Zapatistas say, right? Like un buen vivir, right? Like we want a good life. And so I think that to the question, right? Like to the question's point, I think that it's not just about like, to me, ethnic studies is about going back and serving the people, right? So when I got this PhD in ethnic studies, I was pretty happy. I was glad that I got a job afterwards, right? This has opened up so many other spaces, right? And so I'll share like just one of the things that to me is more important than just like, let's say, for example, building a Central American Studies department, right? Like that's a big thing for a lot of us who are Central American Studies folks. Yes, that's important. I would love to cultivate a grandiose like future for Central American Studies. I also would like people with PhDs and expert, to become expert witnesses so that our people who are seeking asylum can have legal support so that they can flee the conditions of violence that are created in the isthmus. Queer folks, trans folks, people fleeing gang violence, people fleeing poverty, hunger, et cetera, et cetera. I've been fortunate enough to do that. Right? I've been fortunate enough, like I just got a call earlier today from a case that I worked on that I served as an expert witness for workplace discrimination against a Central American elder at a supermarket locally here in Southern California who was experiencing racism, not from white workers, but from Mexican workers, coworkers, and Mexican supervisors who kept calling him a cerote, which means a piece of shit, which is a common, derogatory thing that Mexicans have used and lobbed against Salvadorans specifically, right? And not only the words, but we're forcing this person to come back as they were injured pretty badly from a cut at work and not, treating them with dignity. And so then I was able to kind of, come in and give kind of reasoning to why that is discrimination, right? Which exceeds the boundaries of the law and exceeds our, narrow understandings of race and ethnicity sometimes, right? That exist, which is like, oh, we're all Latinos. How can we be racist against each other, right? But these are very real things. And I hope that this elder wins a lot of money and is able to rest, right? So I think that going beyond, right, and using these things as tools and seeing them as tools and not the end of the line is really important when it comes to ethnic studies and becoming ethnic studies scholars, right? Is that we can't get lost in the sauce, so to speak, right? We can't lose sight that everything is about the battle just on campus, right? It has to go beyond the campus. And if we are going to stay just on campus, I love what was said before by my colleagues here, right? Then we've got to be about it in that classroom and really transform what that space is, right? And encourage and invite students to go back outside. And so I think it calls upon us to be more connected to the outside world and have that inform the inside of our classroom. And I hope that answers the question, David, and to anyone else who's thinking about that, right? I think we can materially impact folks' lives for the better when we, ascend and get certain credentials. And I don't think the end of the fight is just, departments and institutional, situations, I think that's part of it, but there's more.
That's a great word to end on, Alejandro. Thank you. And so I'm just thinking today, there was about 30, 40 of us that shared this space. There was more folks on the Facebook Live. I got some messages from homies that were over there. And then this recording serves as a living document that we can always go back to. So just want to thank Lucha and Santiago for inviting all of us and putting this event together. I'm going to pass it back to y'all.
Yeah, Ron. Hey, I want to thank you for doing an excellent job with the moderation. You were chosen for a specific reason, and for bringing your expertise, your involvement, all of the love, all of the passion, everything that you have brought to the ethnic studies movement, over these past 10 years. You've always been there for everyone, and you're a really good person. And Alejandro, thank you for leaving us with those final palabras, and Cynthia, thank you so much. And Silvia, thank you, to the both of you. And we know how important that community college population is, to our communities, our Native American community. Right now I see Jeremy is on board with us, who is from the Quiche tribe, one of our local Gabrielino sectors here. So thank you, Jeremy. We see you there. But yeah, this is exactly what we had envisioned. A practice of solidarity and an artifact that we can have on record. As we continue to, journey along with our students and fight alongside our communities. That was an excellent, rendition that Alejandro, guided us through in a really good way. And we feel, those peoples that have passed on. Lucha, do you want to say a few things?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to thank everyone that participated, all the speakers. Thank you for creating this space. And I want to remind everyone that in the program that I've been sharing in the chat, the last page has a save the date of the events that we will be having for the remainder of the year and then going into next year as well. So check those out. I hope we get to see everyone. Thank you for taking the time. I know our time is very limited. Our capacities are we're burnt all the time, right? So thank you everyone for making the time to be here, for sharing. I hope that you all feel empowered as we kick off this new school year to have tools that we could implement right away in our classrooms and, to continue doing the work, knowing that we have communities, maybe not at our campuses all the time, right? But we're all in solidarity with each other across campuses, and that's important.